speaker.
I don't know if I'm got to keep an eye on him. I can get my other eye. But.
I want to go back to something you said earlier about what is an evil person. It seems almost as if you're arguing for quantitative numbers for the number of evil versus the number of good. What about qualitative evil? Looking at it that way, the way Mill does, and saying there are just, maybe there's some one-off acts or a few small actions or individual actions that are so bad that the person can't be good. Child murder. That the person murders a child every year, but is an exemplary father and so on all the rest of the time. So the quantity is in his favor, but you've got those cases of him killing kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. There's a whole category of cases that I haven't tried to deal with here, and I don't mean to minimize the importance of them, but there are cases of abnormal people where there's mental disorder or psychoses and so on, who do all kinds of things. And I haven't tried to address issues of that sort. And I think someone who goes out and murders a child once a year or something that's an aberrational type of act. Whether such a person of that kind is evil, I think it's very difficult to tell, because very often people of that sort, they are so mixed up mentally, it would be hard to sort through their motives and intentions. Often some of the serial killers, Son of Sam killer, I remember a number of years ago, they think God tells them to do these things. And they're mistaken in that, but they're acting on a belief that they think is divinely commanded or divinely inspired and so on. So I don't have a simple answer to that, but I simply want to acknowledge that there's a category of aberrational behavior that requires very different kind of analysis from the one I've tried to give here. Yes?
I was actually thinking, well, differently. I was thinking during your talk about people who would be categorizing as sociopaths, if that's what the term. Do you think that, well, I guess a couple of questions. Do you think that if we were ever potentially to be able to get out of this violence against violence cycle that we were in, that maybe the only people that could be called evil would be those people? Or also, do you think that those people could even necessarily be called evil? Because some of them, I think, you could actually say their motives are specifically to
maybe
without looking at people and saying that they deserve it. But I don't know. Maybe that would be the only category that.
It might very well be. Certainly that's a possibility. I don't rule that out. And I'm not saying that there aren't evil people. I'm only saying that it's not easy to be sure that there are evil people and to identify who they are. It may be that some of those people are so confused in their thinking that it's difficult to make a coherent judgment about their character, because to represent someone as evil, evil is a rational manifestation of a person's thinking. And an evil person, the paradigm of an evil person, like Satan. Satan, a highly intelligent person or being, a fallen angel. And but if you conceptualize someone or hypothesize someone whose thinking is sufficiently mixed up, it's hard to know what kind of judgment to make. I think the notion of quantitative issue that Dennis Cooley was raising is an interesting one also when it comes to the issue of violence and nonviolence, because most of the people who engage in violence, whether it's whether it's authorized violence of the sort the military tends to engage in and the police engage in, or whether it's criminal violence of the sort the murderers and rapists and so on engage in. Most of those people, from a quantitative standpoint, aren't engaged in violence very much of the time. Even a serial killer, they only kill periodically. most of the time, they're engaged in just ordinary living. They have jobs generally and so on, the way other people do. So there's a sense in which they are not being violent most of the time. And if you quantify the amount of violence that they do, or at least the amount of time they spend doing violence, it's a very small percentage of the time. Even the military, armies aren't engaged in fighting all of the time. Even in a war, the army isn't engaged in fighting all the time. It's a small percentage of the army that consists of the combat troops, and the combat troops aren't even fighting all of the time. They have battles and so forth, and then there are respites. And so the violence that is that is done by people, even where there are good intentions and so on, from a purely quantitative standpoint, is relatively small by comparison with the amount of time in which they're acting basically in a non-violent way, which suggests that what holds us together in society and peoples and so on is really basically the non-violent conduct of peoples, and without that, we probably couldn't have anything like society and community of the sort that we have at the present time.
I find myself incapable of even swatting the dog, but I wonder, you know, I think about, well, for example, if I saw someone harming my child, I'm not sure what I would do. Mm-hmm. Where does that fall? Mm-hmm. I don't know what I do. I'd like to think I've probably told that. You know, I mean, yeah. It's a, do you stand by and allow that to happen?
Yeah, that's,
I'm not sure
whether or not, well, let me connect that with what I was talking about in the paper. If whatever you do in that case, I think would not make you an evil person, and I wouldn't take to represent the doing of evil on your part, because from what you've said, and I'm surmising, you'd be acting out of love for your children, desire to protect.
I think I'd snap.
Well,
no, seriously.
Oh, okay. I would assume that it would be the intense love for your children that would cause you to...
Rather than something kind of...
Yes, rather than, yeah, that's what I think, yeah. We have another philosopher here, Phil. He also took his PhD from the University of Rochester, as did Dennis, so I feel like I have to call him.
I like your analysis of evil. When I've talked to people informally and suggested similar notions that maybe there aren't that many evil people, people seem very resistant to that. And I'm wondering why you think the concept of evil is so important to mind.
That's good. I find exactly the same thing to be true, and I think that I think people are sort of invested psychologically in wanting there to be evil in the world, because once you've got evil people out here, then you can do pretty much whatever you want to them, and the gloves are off, so to speak, and you can bomb them, you can kill them, you can destroy their homes, their villages, their cities, and so on without compunction. But if you're mistaken about that, and that's what I'm trying to get people at least to consider is a possibility, if you're mistaken about that, and if those people, if you understood their motives and intentions and so on, maybe no different from you, and maybe just as good or indifferent and so on as you are, if you come to understand that, then it's not as easy to kill them, to harm them, to destroy their families and their homes and so on. But I think there has to be, people have to open their minds to considering this possibility. And it involves then thinking of others, putting yourself in the position of others, and thinking of them in the same way in which one thinks about oneself and one's friends and family and so on. And perhaps seeing, and this is where I think this way of thinking leads ultimately, to see that basically people aren't that different from one another. And that thinking of violence as a way of dealing with the harm that other people do is just counterproductive. And that's why I think it begets violence, and I think we have to find ways not only to overcome the fear within ourselves, but we have to find ways to dispel the fear that other people have of us. And if you travel very much and talk with people about social, political, international issues, you'll find an awful lot of people fear America and hate America. And these are two notions that are closely connected. And if you want to minimize violence in the world, you have to find a way to dispel that fear. Using violence doesn't do it. That just intensifies fear. But if you're nonviolent with someone, they have nothing to fear from you. You have your hand up? Yeah.
These examples that we've cited of quantifiable violence, as in, like, for instance, Dr. Goulet's with a person who kills a child once a year or something. How is that not sort of evidence that evil isn't quantifiable in that way?
Well, okay, good question. What I think is quantifiable is the incidence of killing, infliction of harm, destruction, deprivation, and so on, because we can identify the specific acts or policies or practices, so we can quantify that. And every week with the war in Afghanistan or the war in Iraq, you know, they can tell you how many people were killed, how many were wounded, and so on. And so all of that is quantifiable. That is quantifying evil only in the sense of, at most, in the sense of evil actions. I don't think you can quantify evil in motives and intentions. And I think that if there are evil people, those are people whose very character has become evil. And that's kind of a subjective judgment. That's if you like, a qualitative judgment about a person's character and the traits and what go to make up the person. And that I don't think you can quantify. Maybe you could say in a rough sense that one person, if you've got two evil people, maybe one is more evil than another in the sense that you could hypothetically imagine a person who's just thoroughly evil, never has a kind or compassionate or generous thought ever, that every motive and intention is evil. And you could have another person who, well, occasionally pets the dog or gives candy to children, and not for purposes, but so you could, in a very rough sort of way, get some kind of comparison there. But I don't think that evil, in that sense of evil of persons, is quantified. I think that's a qualitative judgment.
Yeah, it seems to me kind of too that trying to quantify evil is sort of like trying to empirically study a rational problem. I mean, because evil isn't necessarily something that we do see. It's something that we, a priori, assign a label to as an action.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. And when I say that to understand evil, even evil of actions, we have to come back to motives and intentions. And there we are talking about qualitative. I don't think quantitative measures really are adequate there. And I don't think we have an altogether adequate moral psychology for fully understanding these issues, because I think the whole idea of motives and intentions is a very complex and difficult area. I'm still thinking about it. I'm not satisfied with all of the things that I've said even in this paper on that particular issue, and especially if there are such things as unconscious motives. That complicates things enormously. It also complicates one's understanding whether or not there are evil people and identifying who they are and so on. So I am in agreement with you that all of this, I think, defies certainly any simple quantitative analysis, maybe even any simple empirical analysis. Yes?
You discuss evil and there is no evil in nature, but there's violence in nature. How do you take into account the differences in violence as far as like what humans do to humans versus what animals do to each other?
Yeah, the violence that animals do to others seems to me not to involve evil, because we don't characterize the animal. We don't think of the animals as evil. They're just doing. The lion is doing what it does. The tiger doing what it does. The hawk when it drops down and grabs the mouse. These are not. There are not motives and intentions of the sort that we associate with rational beings at work in that kind of behavior by animals. And because of that, even though a lot of the violence is terrible, I mean, it's all to watch in some of the documentaries about nature, lions attacking a water buffalo or something and tearing it to pieces. And so it's not pleasant to watch, and it's violent, to be sure, but it's hard to make a plausible case for saying that that represents evil. In the case of human beings, you've got motives and intentions operating in the way in which you don't with animals. So at least you have some of the necessary conditions for evil being present. The only question is whether the particular motives and intentions that are at work when human beings commit violence are of a sort to make them as persons evil. And I'm suggesting that it may not be, and they may not be evil people because of what they're doing. And once again, what has come increasingly to strike me over the years is that most of what I see of the harm and death and destruction that's caused in the world caused basically by decent people, by basically good people. And I suspect this is true pretty much, not altogether maybe, but pretty much around the world. Yes?
I guess my question is, since you made it that we can rationalize what evil is, what do you think has to happen in the world for us to see a day where there is nonviolence? Or do you ever think that will happen?
I think it can happen. I don't have a blueprint for saying how we get from where we are now to get to that point, but I think it has to start with each person thinking about these sorts of issues, and each person thinking about the kinds of policies that are carried out in their name and whether or not to continue to support those policies. And if each person does what he or she can, and maybe just beginning by thinking about these issues, given where they are situated with their particular abilities, their particular intelligence, their particular talents, and so on, without going off and changing your whole way of life, but just doing what you can, being the person that you are in the situation that you're in at the present time, then gradually things can begin to move towards a nonviolent world. That won't happen for a long time to come, but I believe that there is the potential within human beings to do that. And I think indeed that if we don't do that, human beings may not survive. Now this is another thing people don't like to think about, or if they but I see absolutely no reason why human beings should be expected to survive indefinitely. If we go on as we are at the present time, with the rapid development of technology and weaponry and the capacity to kill people, which has accelerated just dramatically through the latter part of the 20th century, I don't think human beings can go on for another 500 years or 1,000 years. Being optimistic, I would say a couple of thousand years at most. There's no reason why we necessarily will survive. Someone said, and he was quoting some book that he'd read, and I've forgotten where this thought came from, but said that we human beings are intelligent, but we may not be quite intelligent enough to save ourselves. Well, one can say, all right, if we continue in this direction, it's going to be catastrophe eventually. And what do we say about that? We say, well, let's maybe some people will come along in another generation or another couple of generations, and they will change things or change directions of things and so on. Well, I say, oh, why not us? Why not us right now? Why don't each of us begin thinking about these issues, taking them seriously, doing what we can, Why wait for others to come along and do it later? So what we need to think about is not just ourselves in this present world and in this present country, but I suggest we need to begin to think about humankind as a whole and what role we can play in helping to preserve it in the long run. And my own conviction is that it has to be by taking seriously the notion of nonviolence and a way of relating to people nonviolently, by trying not to manipulate the fear of people, but to dispel fear in people.
We could start with common courtesy.
Start with common courtesy, sure. Yeah, a very simple way of starting, yes.
I think it was Hannah Arendt that suggested that violence is a case where power is used unjustly. And if we continue that, maybe we could say something like that if somebody is in trouble and your intention is to stop them from being beaten up by a bully, let's say, and we don't use violence to stop it, then maybe we are evil by the lack of violence or the lack of hurt. That's very much like Eric Fromm talks about in his The Heart of Man, about reactive violence, which is violence in service of life. And I think he took that from the prison camp.
Yeah, I take it in the first case you're talking about not acting as being in support of violence that's being done to others. Yeah, that's a very serious issue, and one can hypothesize all different kinds of examples and say, well, what if, and somebody were doing this or that or the other thing, would you not use violence against them? And philosophers are good at that. We get trained to create hypothetical examples. And my way of dealing with that is to suggest that when you're thinking about violence and nonviolence, not to start with the most difficult cases that you can think of and feel that you have to have an answer to those before you can deal with the broader issue of violence and nonviolence, but rather start with the broader issues, worry about the practical or the hypothetical cases in your spare time, or if you have to, or if you're unlucky enough ever to confront a situation of that sort, then deal with it however seems to be right at the moment. But if you start with the hypothetical cases and the very difficult ones, you won't get anywhere, because as soon as you deal with one hypothetical case, if you're talking with someone with a modicum of philosophical ability, they can produce another hypothetical case. You deal with that one, produce another one, and so you just spend endless hours talking about the hypothetical case. Little as though, suppose you were considering taking seriously becoming a vegetarian. And suppose you're talking with someone and somebody says, well, yeah, but if you're a vegetarian, suppose there a rogue cattlemen's association that wants to stamp out vegetarianism because it's bad for the cattle business. And so they kidnap you, and they set you down at a table, and they put a hamburger in front of you. And they say, if you don't eat that hamburger, we'll kill your mother or your grandmother and your favorite second cousin and your Cocker Spaniel. Well, what do? You have to decide, if you want to take vegetarianism seriously, do you have to decide what you would do in that hypothetical case before you decide to become a vegetarian? Well, I'd say don't go at it that way. Think about animals. If you want to take vegetarianism seriously, think about animals, think about use of human resources, et cetera, et cetera. Think about yourself and your preferences and your nutrition and so on. Make a decision on that basis. And if you're ever captured by the Rogue Cattlemen's Association, then do whatever you want. I'd eat the hamburger. I'm vegetarian, but I'd eat the hamburger in a flash to save my grandmother. But I don't think that makes me a bad vegetarian. Well, by the same token, you can think of all kinds of hypothetical cases in which anyone in his right mind probably would use violence. I mean, if you were a hypothetical case and you say, well, if you don't kick Hitler in the shins, 10 million people will die. Well, I'd kick Hitler in the shins to save 10 million people.
You know,
But would I kill 9 million people to save 10 million people? No, I wouldn't do that. That's another story, but I have reasons for that. But the point here is that I think there are different ways of approaching these issues. Some of them I think are they're interesting intellectually, but ultimately counterproductive.
Yeah, I'm not sure how hypothetical this this instant might be, that the killing of Kitty Genovese in New York.
Yeah.
All the people were sticking their heads out of the windows listening to her death cries.
Right.
And they didn't do a thing, and it's not that uncommon.
Right.
It's not hypothetical.
Right. Yeah. This, yeah, you may not all know, was a case in New York City many years ago where a woman was attacked, and over an extended period of time, and people in the buildings around looked out the windows, they saw it, and the attacker even left and then came back and finally ended up killing her, and no one even called the police. They just watched it happen. Not sure what we want to say about that particular example. I don't think that necessarily makes them evil people. I think it means that there was a gross failure on their part, and maybe partly because of the distance and so on. There are various psychological factors, and if you've been following the news, there's a video that has come out of some American helicopter pilots shooting some unarmed civilians in Afghanistan, and psychologists have now weighed in, and you hear the commentary from the pilots about, look at those bastards, you know, we just shot them, and you can see them being shot. And they shot a Reuters cameraman, a journalist, and so forth. But a lot of psychologists are saying if you have enough distance from the harm or the death that you are causing, or perhaps that you are witnessing, it makes it a lot easier to just kind of wash your hands of it and not become involved, which may be part of what was at stake there. You had your hand up again?
I wanted to talk a little bit about, or ask, I guess, historically, you were, I definitely agree with the concept that a lot of these actions that have had the people killing people, they are able to find some sort of reason for why they're committing this murder, like taking out Indians, Native Americans, something like that. But it seems like historically the reasons haven't been very good. Like, it seems like it doesn't take very much to get a person to get past that, taking it another way. And times have changed, and you know, back in the Middle Ages, people were surrounded by death. But I'm trying to wonder, ask, you know, I agree with the concept that it's fear motivated, but is it because they're afraid that their resources will be taken if they don't, or why have the reasons been so poor? You know, and it doesn't take very much to do.
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that. We'd have to look at the various kinds of cases that one is talking about, and certainly we can look back and historically within our own country, and we can see radical transformations in thinking. There was a time when people generally accepted slavery in this country, and the best educated, decent human beings, the government leaders and so on, supported slavery. But now, all of a sudden, we can see that that was just plain wrong. We can see that that was dead wrong, even though it was widely accepted by virtually everyone. By the same token, we can see certain ways of responding to the wrongdoing that people do, or what we perceive as the wrongdoing, namely by trying to obliterate them. And I think we need to undergo the same kind of transformation with regard to the use of violence that people did with regard to slavery. And you ask, well, very often in many of these cases, the reasons that underlay practices of that sort weren't very good, and well, there were different reasons. There were many different rationales for. There were, of course, the economic considerations, but also one of the fairly pronounced argument for slavery was, look, we're Christianizing the slaves. They wouldn't have Christianity otherwise, and that was a powerful motivation for many people. So there are many different kinds of, and once slavery was established, well established, in this country, for example, then I think fear was an element, because people's whole way of life was threatened if slavery were to end. And indeed, their whole way of life was transformed after the war and with the institution of slavery gone. So I think there are many different factors that entered in there, and one would have to look at, one would have to take different cases of the kind of practices that you're talking about and try to analyze them, and you'd probably find many different strands that contributed to them.
Can I ask?
Sure.
Okay. I'm sorry. So if you have a fear in place, would almost any excuse to take that person out work, or do you need to have? I mean, it seems like you have a fear, and then as long as there's some sort of reason, even if it's not good, it'll work, because then you're justified.
The more intense your fear, I think the easier it is to find a rationale for doing whatever you want to do. Yes?
I am actually, still not convinced by the reasons that you gave about why, evil, persons might not exist. Because when you were previously talking, you seemed actually to define that someone is an evil. We can call the person, evil when he has motives and evil motives and intentions, and which are predominant in that person. And just take a very small example of a serial killer, for example. And sometimes before killing someone, I guess you might have first the intentions to do it. And I even think that even in law, sometimes they usually even take into considerations the intentions, but before passing to the act. And I think if someone might have first, the intentions of killing someone, and if we can consider those intentions as, evil, and intentions most of the time they work with motives. Why, can't we consider, the person then who is practicing that act as, evil? And the other point is that we have intentions are not, I would even say, measurable, and we can know that we can actually know intentions by seeing the acts, the violent act that the person has committed. And if it is that, if that's why can't we really confirm that that person is evil, since he has evil intentions and motives of killing someone? And how do you determine that predominance of those evil motives and intentions?
Yeah, you've got a lot in there, and a lot of the issues of trying to understand motives and intentions. And one question that's raised by what you're saying is whether or not we can tell what in a person's intentions are just by observing their physical behavior. I've had lots of disagreements with people on this. I think sometimes it's pretty plausible to suppose in a given context what a person's intentions are from what they're doing. But other times I think you have to know something about what's going on in the person's mind. That is, you need to know what the mental components are that stand behind an action, a physical action, before you can be confident what the intentions are. But even leaving that aside, even if we can sometimes plausibly identify what intentions are from what a person does, still that doesn't suffice to tell us whether the person performing the act is an evil person, because we don't know from watching one act or maybe even several acts whether what we're seeing are manifestations of the basic character of the person, or whether these are special circumstances in which fear or threat or misguided ignorance and so on are the explanation of the act. Insofar as considerations of that kind become part of the explanation, then they become part of the motivation, because what explains why one intends what one does gives one's motivation. And that's why it's very important, say in a court of law, in a trial, you're always, the prosecution always wants to establish a motive. So you show that somebody killed another person, pulled the trigger of the gun or whatnot. Still, if you want to know what the person's mental state is, which is part of what they try to establish in the law, you have to know why the person did that. You have to know what the motivation is. And you can't infer that just from a characterization of the physical act. So I like all of what you're saying there. I think it's a way of defining what the complications are and trying to sort through all of these complicated issues of motives and intentions and how we relate them to conduct. I don't have answers to all of those, but that's basically how I see the issue at the present time.
I'm going to do my duty as moderator and end it on that note. If you have further questions, please come up to the front and you can talk to Professor Holmes. But let's thank him for coming.